Well, good evening, everybody. We nearly have a full house, and there's no doubt 2 or 3 more to come, but I think we should get underway. I welcome you to the second of this year's Dean's Lecture Series. It's a particularly special event. It's a special event for 2 reasons. One, it's Professor Steve Dinham's inaugural professorial address, but it's also the first public lecture that we've held in our new space in the Graduate School of Education. Clearly, this building offers fantastic facilities not only for our staff but our students as well. So after the lecture, we're going to christen the new building in the foyer outside, and you're all invited to help us christen it. I'm going to introduce the Provost, Professor John Dewar, in a few seconds, but I acknowledge Professor Ron Slocum, who's President of the Academic Board, who is here, and also Professor Pip Patterson, who's the Deputy Vice-Chancellor Academic. I'm delighted that you've been able to join us. The Graduate School's committed to working with a variety of partners, and it's fitting that tonight's lecture actually represents that partnership. It's a partnership that the Graduate School has through Professor Dinham and the Australian Institute of Teaching and School Leadership. And tonight's lecture talks a little bit about that relationship and where it goes. But before proceeding, I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people. They're the traditional custodians of this land, and I do pay my respect to the elders both past and present of the Kulin Nation and extend that respect to other Indigenous Australians present. I have sincere apologies from Minister Peter Hall. He wanted to be here tonight, but he was asked by the Premier to represent the Premier at another function, and he's very disappointed indeed that he can't be here. But in his stead, I'm delighted that I invite the University's Provost, Professor John Dewar, to introduce Stephen and to welcome you all. Please welcome Professor Dewar.
Thank you very much, Field. I'd like to begin by congratulating you, Field, and your colleagues in the Graduate School on having the vision that has led to the creation of these spectacular new premises, which have only opened very recently. It's part of a programme of refurbishment that we've been undertaking across the university, particularly focusing on providing outstanding learning spaces for our graduate schools. And I think this gives you a very fine example of what we've been able to achieve with some fairly modest buildings, but some imagination and vision, what we can bring about. So congratulations to Field and his colleagues in the Graduate School of Education. And I think it does provide us with a home that's worthy of the high ideals of one of Australia's finest schools of education. Now, my happy task tonight is to introduce Professor Steve Dinham. But before doing that, I just want to recall some of the guiding vision which informs the work of the Graduate School of Education, which I think is relevant to Steve's talk to us tonight. And that is that the Graduate School works to create a society in which education enables full and equitable participation. Now, tonight's inaugural professorial lecture will take us to the cutting edge of debate on that very important social objective. Because in Australia today, as I'm sure you all know, the debate on national teaching standards takes us right to the heart of this issue of social inclusion and equity. Now, as one of the most influential scholars researching in this field, Steve has played a really important role in shaping the draft national teaching standards for teachers and principals. And again, as I'm sure many of you know, these are now taking on a form of life of their own through the labours of AITSL, the Australian Institute for Teaching and School Leadership. This close engagement with the national standards means that Steve is really well positioned to comment on the many factors that impact on teacher quality and the retention of teaching staff, including issues to do with salary and career structures. And I suspect that no one here needs to be told how important these themes are and how intimately connected they are to the challenge of social disadvantage. The scholarly community more generally, but particularly that in faculties of education like this, is also well aware of the strong connections between educational attainment, opportunity and success. And we know in particular that good teaching and good schooling are absolutely vital in the struggle to overcome disadvantage and to build a more inclusive and equitable society. And we can look forward with confidence, I think, to Steve guiding us skillfully on this issue tonight. But of course, it's one thing to affirm the importance of good teaching and good schooling, but quite another to make it all come about. And on that score, I'd like once again to pay tribute to the wonderful work being done here at the Melbourne Graduate School of Education, particularly through its Master of Teaching programme. If I were to allow Field to address you on this subject, which is probably a topic for another occasion, he would tell you that his ambition and those of his colleagues is no less than to transform the teaching profession in this country. And with that very modest objective, it provides an important context, I think, for what Steve is going to be telling us tonight. But one point that I have heard Field make, and it's a really good one, is that on graduation, 90% of our Master of Teaching graduates say that they feel either very well or well prepared for life in the classroom. This compares dramatically and very favourably with earlier evaluations of undergraduate teacher education programmes in Australia and overseas, where the figure is usually well below 50%. So it's evident that this graduate school is doing something not just very distinctive, but something really positive that is taking it well on the path to achieving that ambition to transform the teaching profession in this country. So from a national perspective, but also from the point of view of this university, tonight's lecture is a significant moment. And it's my pleasure now to introduce and to say a few introductory words about our speaker, Steve Dinham, as the university's inaugural Professor of Teacher Education. Stephen came to the university earlier this year with a well-established reputation as one of Australia's leading experts on teacher education. He was previously Research Director at the Australian Council for Education Research, ACER, and before that he's taught in government secondary schools in New South Wales and at the universities of Western Sydney, New England and Wollongong. He has an extensive list of publications, of which I'm only going to mention one, and that is his book published in 2008, How to Get Your School Moving and Improving, which some of you may have read, which has been extensively used, particularly by newly appointed principals, as an invaluable guide to managing and improving the teaching workplace. Steve has also proved himself, I might say, to be a wonderful contributor to the senior leadership team in the Graduate School of Education. As you can see, he's also the Director of Learning and Teaching in the Graduate School, and I know from my interactions with him and with the leadership team in the Graduate School what a great contribution he's making on that front. But tonight, he's speaking to us as a scholar and as an expert in his field of expertise. The title of his lecture is Let's Get Serious About Teacher Quality, the Need for a New Career Architecture for Australia's Teachers. So it's now my real pleasure to invite Steve to deliver his inaugural professorial lecture on that theme. Please welcome Professor Steve Dinham.
Thank you, everybody, for coming, and thank you, Phil, for the invitation, which I could hardly refuse. I actually wrote this lecture a little while ago, and I was just reflecting this morning on where it had come from, because you can sort of forget where the journey's been. So I just sort of reflected back, and I think really this started with my PhD, which I completed in 1992, which looked at teacher resignation. It's a very positive topic. But it looked at teacher satisfaction, motivation, and the sort of things that attract people to teaching and the reasons why they leave. And that led to a much larger study with Catherine Scott, who's in the front row, it was more of a quantitative study which we conducted across about 8 countries in total. It's still going, it's still being replicated. And that was an attempt to sort of quantify some of the things that had come out of the earlier work. And I also began in the late 90s to research effective or successful teaching with colleagues at the University of Western Sydney, Paul Ayres and Wayne Sawyer in particular. In 2000, I was at the time state president of ACE in New South Wales, and I was asked by the minister to develop a new teaching award, a quality teaching award, which would cover the early childhood, primary, secondary, TAFE and university sectors, government, non-government. So I chaired the working party responsible for that. It had two briefs. One was to recognise exemplary teachers, but the other was to research their practice. And that led to a project which is ongoing. I chaired it until mid-2007 when I came down here to Victoria, and it's been quite significant in road testing a lot of the ideas that I'm going to be talking about tonight. It was based, for example, on a set of standards, professional teaching standards, which have been developed under the leadership of Paul Brock, involving AARE, AXA and ACE. And we used those standards as a sort of frame for what we were doing. Probably the next significant thing was that in 2000, year 2000, colleagues at the University of New England, Western Sydney and the Department of Education in New South Wales won an ARC grant to examine processes in schooling leading to outstanding educational outcomes in years 7 to 10. And that 4-year project produced a wealth of material, and one of the key things that I took out of that was a lot of work on leadership, turnaround schools, low SES schools, schools that have become very, very successful. Probably the next significant thing in this journey, if you like, was in 2002, I was appointed to the interim committee which set up the New South Wales Institute of Teachers as being the sole teacher education rep, and we developed the standards and the processes that are now in place there. Also in 2002, I was asked to join a national Commonwealth inquiry into teaching and teacher education, which Brendan Nelson had established. And again, I was the only teacher educator on that, so you're always sort of fighting a bit of a battle to convince people that no, in fact, this is the way it really is. But that was a very good experience too, in terms of giving me background to where I am with this today. In 2008 at ACER, myself and colleagues Lawrence Ingverson and Elizabeth Kleinhans won a tender to map the graduate teachers across Australia for ATRA, Australasian Teacher Regulatory Authorities. And then later that year we were asked by DEWA, we won a tender with DEWA, to both map and consolidate the teaching standards at the various levels across Australia, including leadership standards and principal standards. And that work was an important precursor for the current national AITSL standards. So in that time since, I've continued to work very much in the area of quality teaching, leadership, teachers' professional learning, and working with various bodies in Australia and overseas. In 2010, I was asked by AITSL to conduct a national piloting of the principal standard, and there were 10 projects involved with that across Australia. So that's where I'm sort of coming from, and that's the reason for giving that list of involvements, I suppose. It's a platform that goes back about 20 years, and I think it's an important base for what I'm going to say today. Now, I want you to hold this thought in your mind for the remainder of this particular exercise. I think we're all fascinated with real estate to one degree or another. Okay. Now, just a bit of background, and up until the mid-60s, the view was that schools make almost no difference to student achievement, which is basically largely predetermined by socioeconomic status, family circumstances and so-called innate ability. And the Coleman report of '66 was probably instrumental in that view, but research since has really refuted that quite strongly. We know that SES and family background do exert an influence on student achievement, but they're not a life sentence, which was the earlier thinking. We know that teachers teaching in schools, and I put can in brackets there because can make a significant difference to student learning and development. And as a result, since the 80s, we've been really much on this track. Work from the OECD, for example, various national and international reports on teacher quality. I put this to you, and I sort of came to this conclusion a year or two ago, that I think from the research that we've been doing over a period of time, we've got a pretty good idea what good teaching looks like. We've got a pretty good idea how teacher expertise develops. The work of David Berliner and so on has been instrumental there. But we also know that teacher quality varies widely. It varies in two senses. The first is that no one comes out of their teacher training being a fully formed autonomous professional. So it varies as we develop our expertise, but it also varies from teacher to teacher. And in fact, it varies more within schools than between schools. So the big issue for us is, well, how do you get a quality teacher in every classroom? And this is a quote from something that Lawrence Ingverson, who unfortunately isn't here tonight, and Elizabeth Kleinhens and I did for the Business Council of Australia, which I'll refer to a little bit. I'm not going to engage in conference karaoke. You're perfectly capable of reading that. But I will read the last bit. To make best practice common practice. That's the aim of the exercise. Now, I find the Melbourne Declaration a particularly good frame because when we start talking about evidence, for example, there's a bit of a sort of Pavlovian response that it's all about standardised testing and so forth. Now, the Melbourne Declaration governs all of us, all systems in Australia, and when I talk to groups of teachers and so on, as I do frequently, the level of awareness is not terribly high. And yet it's a very, very good frame, and it comes from earlier work, the Adelaide Declaration and the Hobart Declaration, roughly 10-year intervals prior to it. First goal, very succinctly summarised, is that Australian schooling promotes equity and excellence, and whether we're talking as a nation or we're talking as an individual school, that's a very, very good frame. What are we doing about excellence? In other words, lifting the bar, if you like, lifting achievement overall. How do we know we're doing it? Where's the evidence? And then what are we doing about equity? And there is this tension between, if you like, raising the bar and closing the gap. And there is some evidence that, we do well on international measures such as PISA, but we are slipping back a little bit. Combination of two things. Other countries are coming on and overtaking us to some degree, but also we're slipping back a little bit, particularly at the top end. So that's a challenge for us. And again, within every school, as well as the nation as a whole, all students become successful learners. That's the academic side, if you like. Confident, creative individuals, that's the personal side. Active, informed citizens, that's the social side. So it's a very, very good frame that can be used from anything from a classroom to a nation. Now, John mentioned this book, and I'd been involved, as I mentioned, in a whole lot of research over a period of time, and wanted to put this in one slim volume. It had to be less than a certain number of pages so we could sell it for less than $40, all those sort of pragmatics. But it was really about speaking directly to people about real teachers, real schools, an evidence base, what actually does work. And since it's been published at the end of 2008, I think it's up to about 7 or 8 reprints the last time I looked, so it's been encouraging how it's been accepted. This is just a quote from page 1. And it's an odd thing to have to say, but in actual fact, you don't have to go back too far to remember a time when you could sort of sit there during a staff development activity for a day and you sort of play bingo. When will teaching and learning be mentioned? When will students be mentioned? Usually it was about 2 o'clock in the afternoon or something. Our focus was elsewhere. It wasn't on teaching and learning. But in fact, the good teachers, of course, the good schools have always had that focus. Now, in the book, there's a very, very simple little model, but I think, it's a useful frame. What do you see in successful classrooms, faculties, schools, even systems? You see a central focus on teaching and learning, obviously, but every student is known as a learner and a person. That's the academic and the personal. Now, in some classrooms, in some schools, the focus is more on one than the other. It might be on the learning side. Okay, we are a school of high standards. We want to get as many people as possible to get 99 point whatever and get into medicine at Melbourne University. Or we focus more on the person here, and often the language is a giveaway. You know, difficult area, unemployment, social issues and so on. When you start to hear that sort of language, it's a language which condemns students to underachievement. It's basically a low expectations model. Now, I've done a lot of work in low SES schools that are very successful, and they get that balance right, learner and the person. So every student needs to be known by somebody. And it's a tragedy that some kids go through a week, a month, even a term, even longer, without a personal contact being made with the teacher, getting to know them, and getting to know the teacher as well, which is quite important. So what else do you see? You see leadership as being the big enabler. You can have good teaching without having a good school. You can't have a good school without good leadership. And when we talk about leadership today, we talk about leadership in terms of the formal positions of leadership, but also what we would call distributed leadership, teacher leadership. Because every teacher is a leader. When they take a classroom, they're a leader. When they serve on a committee, when they take a sporting group, a music group, they're a leader. So leadership is the big enabler. It's a lever to improve what happens in schools. What else do you see? You see professional learning as being almost an ongoing fixation. There's no coincidence that the most successful teachers, faculties, schools are never satisfied. They don't sit back and say, we know everything, we've got it worked out. They're continually pushing ahead, which is why they're successful in the first place. And finally, you see quality teaching, which again is another yin and yang type situation. The quality of the teacher, the quality of teaching, and how they reinforce each other. Now, I want to unpack those a little bit before I get to my main argument, which is about teaching standards and how we can utilise those. Just very quickly. I like that quote. It's very succinct. You can see 1997, been around for a while. And this is from our BCA report for the Business Council of Australia. Thanks. So there's a number of agendas there. There's a national agenda, there's a bigger picture, but there's also the individual student. Just another quote for you that I like as well. So every child is entitled to good teaching, but we certainly need to get good teaching where it's needed most and where it can actually make the most difference. In other words, off a low base. Now, just a little bit about professional learning, another part of that triangle that I showed you earlier. And again, a fairly ruthless summary. Fad, fantasy, idealism, ideology or rhetoric. I use witchcraft sometimes and superstition. Now, what do we need? Well, in terms of pre-service and in-service education, if we can put the two of them together, the first thing is obviously a very strong evidence base. We have to know what we're doing works. I think the next thing that comes through strongly in terms of a necessity, if you like, a need, is close, respectful, productive, meaningful partnerships. There's been too much division between the various stakeholders and the various sectors. I think we need to be able to produce graduates at both levels who are critical users and increasingly gatherers of research and data. Put the fads, superstitions, habits, trendy nonsense to the test. Unfortunately, we are suckers for whatever comes along and seems attractive and shiny and new. I've mentioned knowing every student as a learner and a person, and that includes all the way through. I mean, teachers in a school need to be known as learners and people. Principals do. Clinical approaches, and this is one where, as John mentioned, Phil could wax lyrical for quite a period of time, but certainly being able to diagnose, identify, prescribe, analyse, and that's part of knowing every student as a learner and a person. The so-called individualised approaches to instruction are all predicated on knowing people, knowing them well. And then this business of breaking a cycle, which John also alluded to, breaking the cycle of teachers thinking and teaching as they were taught, and being sucked back into the prevailing culture. And obviously what we're trying to do here with our Master of Teaching graduates is to break those sorts of cycles. And I think above all though, its impact on student learning and development, because that's what we're really about. It's not just about getting the teaching practice right. It's a bit like saying, well, I taught them but they didn't learn. Well, the operation was a success but the patient died. Okay? We have to really look at what the impact is. Now, this is the sort of traditional approach to teacher learning that many of us went through, and it's a sort of linear type journey, if you like, development of expertise, ad hoc in many cases, luck of the draw where you get sent, what sort of reception you get. Increasingly, though, we're seeing these sorts of approaches. Now, action research has been around for a while. Its younger sibling, action learning, is more recent, where people are actually being assisted to conduct research in their schools on problems of importance to them, and I'll get to that in a moment. We can't leave mentoring to chance, so we're looking at more formal relationships there. There's the issue of professional standards, of course, and certification, both at mandatory and voluntary levels. That's going to increasingly drive professional learning in the years to come. The notion of professional learning modules that I've been involved in from the Australian College of Educators, BASTO, various other places. The notion of learning communities has been around for a while. The notion that an organisation like a school can learn, if you like, the synergies there. But increasingly we're talking about communities of practice. So it's not just individual schools, but schools being linked and schools being linked to other bodies as well in terms of learning, information, sharing and so forth. I would sort of summarise the trends in teacher learning thus. I'd take this probably back to the mid-70s for two reasons. One, I can barely remember them. That's when I started teaching. But also that's when the funding really started flowing through for in-service. Up to that time, it was really left to the individual. I think these are all pretty self-explanatory. Now, the left-hand column will continue to need for certain things, but I think we need to sometimes distinguish between the administrative stuff, the mandatory reporting aspects and all of that from the actual professional learning, if you like. Context is important, but context can be a swamp. It's very easy sometimes to justify your lack of action on the basis of, oh, well, these kids, this area, this school or whatever, but certainly, you know, the idea of off-the-shelf packages, which some of us endured during the 90s, we've moved beyond that, fortunately. A lot of on-site learning embedded. Obviously, we're concerned about outcomes or impacts. It's much more an interactive model of learning. The external partner rather than the external expert, and a very good example of this was the Australian Government Quality Teaching Program, which myself and two colleagues from UTS, Laurie Brady and Peter Orbison, evaluated. More community learning. Much more learning is collaborative than was the case previously. Much more about solving problems of importance, identifying, prioritising, attacking those. And it's not just about changing things, it's about changing people, what people know, think, value, can do. And that's possible. And when we did the evaluation of the AGQTP and went around the countryside, we saw many, many people in their 40s and 50s who were, by their own admission, had been re-energised through involvement in that project. And people said to us straight up, you know, the topic of conversation in the staff room has changed. It used to be gardening, golf and superannuation. You know, now we're talking about teaching and learning. We used to complain about Year 9, now we're talking about teaching them. Action learning, doing research, and obviously that student learning focus, which was largely absent before for some strange reason. Oops, I've got to get myself back again. All right. Now, a bit on leadership, because as I said, it's the enabler, it's the lever. And just a few quotes I've gathered which I like, including there from the late Ken Rowe, who was a colleague at ACR. Here's one from John Hattie. So you can see a slightly different emphasis there on maybe what leadership was conceptualised as being maybe 5 or 10 years ago. And I've done a range of projects involving talking to people about leadership and why they got into leadership, and in some cases it's the negative example. Well, you know, I could do better than that. Such and such has been such a poor example. One from Bill Mulford. So I think those quotes show you a bit of the flavour for the redirection of leadership, the reorientation of leadership in schools. And one more, and because it's me, it's a longer quote. I'm allowed to do that. influences. That gives a little bit of a flavour. Leadership has direct and indirect influences, but it's all about creating the conditions in which teachers can teach and students can learn. So these are the essential messages from this first part, which is the sort of foundation for what I want to move to. We're starting to realise that data is our friend. It was seen to be our enemy for a while, but I think we've moved through that, and people are now increasingly using data of all sorts, not just standardised tests, which is the default position, in fairly sophisticated ways for diagnostic purposes and so forth. And the vision thing, everyone got bashed over the head with vision during the 1990s. You had to have a vision. For some people it ended up being a nightmare, but anyway, vision's nice, it's knowing where you're going, and if you don't know where you're going, well, you're probably not leading, but it needs to rest on evidence. So, how can we engage then with the AITSL agenda, particularly the new standards that we've got? I want to look at two things to begin with, the key role of standards and also